Hi, my name is Cecile Johnson, CEO of African Development Plan, and I'm here today as part of GlobalCityUnity's community outreach to keep you informed about issues affecting the global Black community. These issues require us to be unified and be on one accord to find solutions. So today my guest is Kamm Legislative Commission Chair of NCOBRA and a Commissioner of the National African American Reparations Commission. He's an activist in the Black community here in Chicago, and this week we'll be focused on the issue of reparations and the new approach reparations activists are taking, which they have labeled reparations enforcement. Welcome, Kamm.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So before we start, we're going to talk a little bit about what is reparations, right? NCOBRA, which is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, has defined reparations as the process of healing, repairing, and restoring a people who have been injured due to their group identity, in violation of their fundamental human rights by a government, corporation, institution, or individuals. And this is a definition that has been adopted by the African and the Afro-Descendant Caucus of the United Nations. Central to this definition is the concept of repair from injuries. Thus, reparations are any resource or allocations of resources that aid to the healing of our entire peoplehood. So remember, healing, repairing, and restoring a people. So today, before we get into it, we're going to ask, why should you care? Well, evidence of racial, economic, and political injustices that affect all of our lives, right? We have a high level of unemployment, underemployment of our adults and youth. We have high levels of violence in our community. We have the absence of an indigenous economic base in our community, the school-to-prison pipeline for our young boys. And 51% of the prison base is our sons, our brothers, our children's fathers, our husbands, etc. We have a higher rate of health issues and disease, and we have targeted chemical agents, and that's drugs, etc., in our communities and schools. So all of these things are evidence of continued process of structural and institutional racism, and this is of importance to you and our community and your children's future. So today we're going to ask our guest, Kamm from NCOBRA, that in the last week of June 2015, so that's just last month, he and other reparations activists issued a new call to President Obama to enact a Reparatory Justice Commission through an executive order, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So tell us, in what way, what was that all about, and in what way is reparations enforcement different from just the plain conversation we used to have about reparations?
Okay, that's like three different questions, so I'm going to take the first one. The executive order, the push call for an executive order. Recently, in April, there was formed a new reparations organization called the National African Americans Reparations Commission. This organization, or this entity, was called by Ron Daniels, Dr. Ron Daniels of the Institute of the Black World. And there was a big conference, summit, international summit in New York, where the commission officially came into existence. We had over 200 people there at the summit from 20 different countries, from the Caribbean, from Europe, a few countries on the continent, and several states here in America were there at the summit. And at this summit, we took the time to, it was patterned after the CARICOM Reparations Commission. A couple of years ago, the Caribbean community of states each developed a reparations commission in their state. In Jamaica has a reparations commission. Barbados, Trinidad, all of the islands that make up, it's a 15-member panel in CARICOM, 15 states of the Caribbean that make up this body. And collectively, those individual states formed a CARICOM Reparations Commission where they're suing the European governments that damaged their humanity, as here the American government, as well as some European governments, damaged our humanity, from which we're still suffering from those things that you spoke of earlier. And so we formed this commission. In June, we had our second meeting as a commission. Now, who's on this commission? In Chicago, Dr. Conrad Worrell is on the commission. Dr. Ivor Carruthers is on the commission. Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright is on the commission. Minister Farrakhan was supposed to be on the commission, but at the time his health was failing, so he appointed Minister Akbar Muhammad, who's the #2 spokesman of the Nation of Islam. My organization NCOBRA appointed me to the commission. Professor Charles Ogletree, who was Barack Obama's and Michelle Obama's law professor at Harvard, is on the commission. Attorney Roger Wareham, who was the brain thrust behind the Durban World Conference Against Racism, is on the commission. Dr. Julianne Malveaux. So you have an attorney, Kechi Taifa, who was a former legislative aide of Congressman John Conyers, and Sister Dr. Reverend Joanne Watson of Detroit, a councilwoman who is a longtime reparations activist. So it's a high-powered commission. So when we were there in Baltimore at this meeting, they asked me to give a report on H.R. 40, which is Congressman Conyers' long-standing bill. I had been working as a legislative commission chair of NCOBRA on that bill for about 6 years. And we have actually had abandoned that bill, abandoned that struggle for several reasons, and I gave a report. After giving my report, the commission stated, well, we can't, we need to focus on another legislative strategy. So it was my suggestion that we pushed President Obama to engage in an executive order to commit a Reparatory Justice Commission, or Reparations Commission, as it was called and debated about in that meeting. And they determined that was a strategy we should take. We should take that strategy for 3 reasons. One, the president has not spoken about reparations since he's been in office in any meaningful way. Although this conversation is being held globally in the African world, in Europe. In fact, the CARICOM Reparations Commission is presenting to the Prime Minister of Britain next week a list of demands. And so this conversation around reparations is happening globally in the African world. We are not just having it here in America to any real extent. And COBRA has been the lead voice, and we've been continuing to push this forward. And so that was the first reason for calling for this executive order, that we were not going to let this guy off for these last 18 months. He was going to speak to African issues, not middle class issues, not poor issues, but African issues, issues for people of African descent. Secondly, we thought that this was an opportunity to galvanize our community around real notion of repair. Most people, when we talk about reparations, they think we're talking about a check. You had Dave Chappelle and many others make these comical type of statements that if African people got a check, we give it all back to the white man in a week, those type of things. But reparations is not about a check, it's about full repair. And under international law, that has certain standards and certain meanings and certain outcomes. And so we thought we can engage our people around a real conversation around repair, what it means. And thirdly, we thought that there's no way we can go into the next administration talking about, black issues, and we let this guy off the hook.
That's right.
It was like, where's,
That's right.
you had a black president for 8 years, you didn't come at him strong, now you're going to come at us.
Right.
And so we know that we needed that momentum. Even if this guy does not do anything, we needed that momentum going into the next administration. So we put the call out in June, the last weekend of June. The National Black Newspapers Association has picked it up, and they distributed it to most of their newspaper affiliates across the country. I have not seen it in the Chicago Defender. I've seen it in the Charlotte News. I've seen it online, and I've seen it in other newspapers, but the Chicago Defender has not picked it up for some reason. But it has been endorsed by the National African American Newspaper Association. So that's one issue. That's one of the pressing issues. This new call for the president to enact a Reparatory Justice Commission.
Based on what you've said, it sounds pretty comprehensive, and it's in line with some of the things I think also, which is the fact that we can't have an African-American president who doesn't address African-American issues.
That's exactly
right. And that same warning that if he does not do something, how can we ask others, right? And how that might be used against us. So I totally agree with that, what's going on there. So if Obama was to agree to create the executive order on reparations, what would that framework look like?
I had the pleasure and honor, and it just kind of fell in my lap, to author the model executive order. And I looked at 4 specific executive orders that he had passed since his presidency. And he passed maybe 30. And so I got a link from Dr. Raymond Winbush, who's also on the commission, on many of the executive orders that he's passed. One was the executive order for educational excellence for African Americans.
Okay.
Another one dealt with HBCUs. A third one that I looked at dealt with trade with Africa. And there was a 4th one that it slips my mind at which one I used. But I took those executive orders and utilized the framework establishing the policy, and then establishing what, under those executive orders, what it would do. And with the one that I authored, we're pushing for the notion of full repair under international standards. America has its own standards of what it calls remedy or redress or repair. In fact, they don't even use the term repair in any of America's law. They may use remedy or redress. The Constitution talks about redress. But under international law, there's a term called full repair. And full repair has 5 components. One of those components is cessation or ceasing of those things that are causing the harm to a people. There's many racially unjust laws in this country that need to be halted. There's the holding of the freedom fighters of this 1960 African Revolution that need to be released. These are things that come under full repair under the notion of cessation, things that must be stopped. And then after cessation comes restitution. How do you return the people back to the way they were had not they been injured? That would take many years and many programs, projects, and policies for that to take place with African people. So reparations for us is not just a one-time thing, it's a process. Under international standards, how do we get back to the way that we were or would have been had not we been injured for 246 years of chattel enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, the 20 or so years of urban blight, and these urban issues that we've been facing, the attack on our community with heroin, and then later with crack cocaine. How do we repair? How do we return ourselves to the African peoplehood that we would have been had not we been subjected to all these atrocities over centuries? And the third component is compensation. Now, that's where most people want to start with reparations and compensation, but we do believe that under international law, there should be many, not just one compensation policy, but several compensation policies. One compensation policy could be the excusing of student loans for some of our young people. That's compensation. That lends them likely to be able to build wealth more sooner than if they're indebted with the student loans. Another form of compensation could be some type of tax relief to businesses, et cetera. That puts money into the businessmen's hands and then allow them to reinvest that in the community. So there's a number of compensation type of policies that can be created that we agree upon. After compensation comes satisfaction. Now, African people all over the planet exist on the bottom and are disrespected and brutalized no matter where we find ourselves, even on the continent. You find white people on the continent have a higher standing than African people on the continent. If you traveled on the continent, you'll see that. And so how do we return our dignity to us? You know, people who were the originators of civilization, who, when Europeans entered Africa, our culture was far surpassing Europeans in the 1500s. And it's only through this destruction of African life and culture have we been pushed to the economic and social and political bottom as far as the world, even as far as the psychology of how other people see us on the planet. They all see us in a degraded position based on these centuries of attack on our peoplehood. So how do we get our dignity back? And a lot of that comes with telling the true history of this world, of this planet. And then final aspect of full reparations is rehabilitation. We suffer from a myriad forms of plantation psychosis, post-traumatic slave syndrome, falsified African consciousness. There's a number of terms that our African psychological scholars have utilized to characterize the psychological injury that we face. When we look at our young brothers and sisters killing each other, or our sisters engaged in the various forms of sex trade and in the sex industry, that's based on the psychological injury that's accumulated and compounded because resources are not utilized to address this. So when we look at full repair under international standards, we're talking about cessation, we're talking about restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. And so we put that into this model of executive order. Now, the likelihood that it'll be passed in that fashion is almost nil, but that doesn't stop us from having this conversation and informing our people and having them make the demand that this is what we're looking for.
Well, I wouldn't agree with you that it's almost nil, right? Because I'm very positive. We have to project what we
That's
want,
right.
right?
That's
So
right.
I think cessation, your freedom, talking about the unjust laws and the freedom fighters,
Sure.
the restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, I don't see anything unreasonable about any of that. And in fact, it's like you're building a house, right? So you're right that the comedians and others want to frame the focus on, oh, they want some money. And you're right, if our current psychosis, right? That money would return to others tomorrow morning in the 6 hours that the money leaves the black community. so that is that the comedy is being real. However, when you begin to address that this is a long-term strategy that includes layers of things that have to happen, including the laws. I mean, every day we're seeing things happen on the TV, with people being killed, and even with it being filmed, they get away, right? So what exactly are they trying to say? So I love this, right? And I would just encourage you to just keep saying that, no, we're not going to back down off of any of this, because we're building a house and everything here is logical, right? And we are logical and reasonable people. So you've talked about how Obama hasn't said anything, but on a global scale, he's kind of out of sync. So he's all over the world traveling and doing all of this, and but this is a global thing that affects black people. CARICOM is doing it. Africa, right? They had some cases come out of there too, right? And so everybody's doing. So this is the time. So what then will be his excuse? And I guess you can answer that as to why he's not even following a global trend, right? So if you need an excuse, the world is giving you one. Not even black America, but the world is giving you one. So why can't you do that? So so that's awesome. We're in a great time. We're talking about global reparations, all the work. I know you've been doing this for quite a while. We had talked about an ordinance that had been here in Chicago, and I've watched how from that ordinance to what we were asking for then, how this has just grown and grown and grown, right? So I think that's really wonderful. People always say to me, when I say reparations, you see, they go right to the money, and they say, so if you got reparations, where's the money going to come from, right? So that's the question I'm going to ask you, because that's one that my son said, and we have to be able to deal with that with the young people, right?
Right. Part of one of the things that we added to this memorandum, not memorandum, but this model executive order, was that there be an interagency working group. Now, the interagency working group is one that exists within the Executive Order for Educational Excellence for African Americans. What it calls for is that every department within the United States government, Department of Education, Department of Health, Department of Commerce, Department of Interior, because we're talking about land, Department of State, because we're talking about repatriation, all these things come into reparations, Department of Health and Human Services, every department within America's governmental system has resources. And so when we talk about this interagency working group, we want and this is not something that is not already there. It's not already being used, because, like I said, in other executive orders, they call for that. So you bring in department heads or department leaders within each one of these departments and form a group that then gets advice and projects and programs and policies from the commission, and then those departmental groups then find the resources within their departments to engage in these projects, programs, and policies. So every department within the United States government has resources. Justice, labor, education. I mean, there's all type of resources. If we have projects, full projects that are national, and we determine what that budget would be in our research and our study, and from our scholars, determine this is the budget to run this project nationally, it can come from these three governmental departments: education, health and human resources, and labor. A particular project may be involved in those three departments, or it may just come under education, or it may just come under commerce. But there's resources within these departments, so it's not like we're trying to bankrupt America. And again, these are long-range projects. We're talking 2-3 generations, because that's how long it's done. I mean, you're talking about people trying to recover from 400 years of suppression, oppression, and repression.
Right.
Not just one, but layers of, when we look at where we're at today, we see that most of our most able thinkers, scholars, activists were murdered and assassinated by this nation,
Right.
or either bad jacketed or locked up or went off into exile. And you see, where our situation is today. So we cannot look at the current black situation and see that that is not a result of oppression, suppression, and repression of our life over the last 400 years.
I think you're right on target with that also. You mentioned researchers and scholars, and Jacob Carruthers talks about the fact that when you dedicate your life to this struggle, people consider you irresponsible, right?
That's correct.
And because you're not making any money doing the activism work, and that's really what has been missing, right, from our researchers and scholars.
Sure.
So we have them, but they've been on the, struggling end, right?
Right.
So this is a long-term strategy. Again, I'm not giving them centuries, because where there is a will, there's a way.
Sure.
And it didn't take too long to destroy us. It's just that it's been a prolonged domestic terrorism. That's what I would call it, right? And all of the systems have been put into place to reinforce it.
Sure.
So what can we as community do to help you? Because we're going to need teams that work on, when we get this funding, because I'm saying we're going to get it,
For
right?
sure.
What is it we're going to use it for, right? So we're going to need teams to do all of this. So tell me, you need help. What kind of help can you get?
Well, the first help is, we can't do anything without pressure on the president or pressure on these other entities that have harmed us as a community. Remember, when you gave the definition of reparations, we looked at the four injuring parties: the government, corporations, institutions, and individuals. So we have, you talked about reparation enforcement. So we have a strategy, what we call reparation enforcement, that goes after each of these entities. The executive order by the president is one form of reparations enforcement. But in order to push him even to the point of talking about reparations, it's going to take a massive push by African people. You look at the gay struggle, you look at the Hispanic struggle, you look at even the struggle in Arabia. I forgot the name, what they call that, the Arab Spring. All of these struggles utilize the African model of struggle. The African model of struggle that was heightened in the 1960s, direct action, civil disobedience, etc.
Right.
We're not utilizing our struggle. Everybody else is utilizing our struggle, our form of struggle, and are getting massive policy and resources directed their way.
Right.
And so we need to, again, utilize our own model of struggle, and that means the masses have to sacrifice some of their time, some of their resources, as it was in the 60s. As we look at others who have utilized our struggle recently, there's been massive sacrifice. There have been bodies on the ground. There's been letters written. There's been emails written. There's been phone calls. There's been work stoppages. There's been all type of actions that get your voice heard. And so if we are going to have a push on this president, that's what we have to do. So we have a support letter that's going around for calling on this executive order. You can go to incobrachicago@gmail.com and say you want to support, and we'll send you a link to that letter. We need your organizations to sign on. We need you to sign on as individual. We already have over, when we submitted the letter to the president, we had 10 of the largest black organizations signed on. And I don't know them all, but the National Black Social Workers, the National Black Psychiatrists, the National Black Psychology Association, and a few more, 7 more. I just don't know the name of them right now. But here in Chicago, we've had over 25 local organizations sign on, as well as over 200 individuals just here in Chicago in the first week. So now that that has went national with the National Black Newspapers Association, we can see that more and more people should be signing on. And then we can begin to direct action in our local areas. Chicago, we're going to have a press release, probably at the federal building, or either at one of the institutions that we're targeting for reparations repair. So the people have to get active. Black folks got to be active, and we have to be singly focused. And most of the organizations that are in our community doing community work would be benefited by a reparations campaign,
Okay.
successful reparations campaign.
So you've basically said that something simple they can do right now is to join by signing on to the letter,
That's
sending
right.
an email to NCOBRA Chicago,
Right.
NCOBRACHICAGO @gmail.com.
That's correct.
Right? It's telling them that you want to be a part of the movement. You're
Sure.
signing on as an individual, and if you are also have a business and organization
Sure.
that you want to sign on as a member of the business or association. I think that this is actually a great start, right? Because those numbers can then be used to say, well, we have XYZ who is in
That's
support
right.
of us, etc. And I'm a little disturbed that the Chicago Defender, right? Going back, I'm a Garvey lover,
Right.
Garveyite. 100 years
Yes.
ago, how my dear sweet Marcus Garvey was,
Maligned.
by the Chicago Defender.
That's
So
right.
I just hope that this is that has nothing to do with that Chicago Defender, right? I just hope that it's just something that just happened there, but that you're not repeating your history, because you would really be on the wrong side of history at
That's
this time,
exactly right.
right? So press release, etc. So it seems to me that you have a comprehensive model. I would encourage people to listen to this tape again and
Sure.
again, and listen to how you've built the story, right? Educate themselves to why we need this, and then just look around. We've done previous shows where we talk about the data that
That's
is
right.
impacting our community,
Yes.
right? And you don't need to see anything more. If we want to say, well, we're afraid to die, just check out the news every weekend and see how many are dying,
That's
right?
exactly right.
So they're not
Yeah.
dying for a reason. They're
Sure.
just dying because of some of the systems that have been put into
Right.
play that intend to wipe us out. So I think that this strategy that you have with the president is right on target, and I salute that. And whatever support we can give, I'm going to really encourage people to be out there to support, something as simple as this, right? Because long term, and I would really encourage us to not want to say it took hundreds of years to get us here, but we can, and other people have,
That's right.
had restitution and restoration in a very short
time.
period of time. It's
Right.
called will and intent,
Right.
right? Milton Friedman says all crisis creates change. The change that occurs from the ideas that are lying around. We need to be totally ready with all of our
Like that.
ideas lying around, because we don't intend to have anyone else's implemented at this point.
I like that.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
Definitely. And thank you for
thank
helping us
you.
get this message out and frame it in this fashion.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things. Too many people who don't have a true understanding of reparations are framing the reparations conversation.
Right.
Because you may have a little knowledge of history, but don't know how it aligns itself with repair and
Right.
the injury.
Right.
Right.
And it's not that black people are lazy, folks, while we are in the condition that we're in. It's really been about a system. So, NCOBRA meets every fourth Sunday in Chicago from 2 to 4 p.m. at Washington Park Fieldhouse, 5531 South King Drive. I want to thank my guest, Kamm Howard, for joining us here this week and for all the good work NCOBRA is doing. My name, again, is Cecile Johnson with African Development Plan, and I want to thank GlobalCityUnity Community Outreach for helping us for giving us this opportunity to speak on a global black community on issues affecting our community and an opportunity to find solutions.